But we come back to this unique history book, a history book of the future. Only one ever written that actually accurately foretold the future of the world. And it came from heaven, from the Lord Jesus Christ himself. As we see in Revelation chapter 1, verse 1, things which must shortly come to pass. So after the time of John. Chapter 4, verse 1, things which shall be hereafter. So it is a history book of the future. What we must take away from this study is the divine perspective that God has on the world and particularly upon the Catholic Church. You know, it says in chapter 17, verse 14, that those who work with Christ to eradicate this system are with him, the called, the chosen, and the faithful. And if we don't share the sentiments of the Lord Jesus Christ, it's going to be hard to be with him in the work that has to be done in removing this system. We need to understand that in the modern world, talking about the destruction and the annihilation of the Roman Catholic Church is not a popular sentiment. God says this is the mother of harlots. It's an abominable system that God despises and intends to make sure that not one shred of it ever remains. And yet in this modern world in which we live, that would be regarded as intolerance, unfriendliness, bigotry. But we have to decide whether we're going to accept the divine viewpoint or go with the way the world sees things, because the world is totally deluded by this church. Oh, yes, today the church might seem benign and reasonable. But we have to remember that God looks down the avenues of history and sees 1,500 years in which this church dominated the world, persecuted people, destroyed estimated 68 million people because they wouldn't accept Catholic teachings. This is a church that has deluded the world. And whenever they get power and armies on their side, the Catholic Church becomes a tyrant. And you can go to so many countries in the world where even today they hold tremendous sway over politics and over the minds of people. They always abuse power. And we're going to see in Revelation 17 the destruction of this Roman Catholic system and the final stage of it when they oppose Christ. I want you to think about this theme of Revelation. You know, God has in Revelation a tremendous focus upon his battle with Rome. It's Zion, the hope of Israel, the hope of the kingdom against the city of Rome. The Romans were involved in the death of the Lord Jesus Christ. The Romans killed the apostles. They tortured the saints. They corrupted the truth. They dominated the world. And we might say, when you look at all those different chapters that Rome's mentioned in and dealt with in Revelation, why is God so focused upon this church? Why is Rome so much in Revelation? Well, it's because Rome is so much a part of history. We live in the 21st century. We don't always understand that for 1,500 years, this church dominated the Western world, the civilized world. And so God's battle is about how he's battling with Rome, how they parade in the name of Christ, how they convince people about the Trinity and hell and heaven and limbo and purgatory and all of these terrible doctrines that they had. And so God's controversy is with Rome. And that's why the book of Revelation has so much to say about Rome. They impacted the world, they controlled the world for that 1,500 years. And it's amazing to think the damage they did in between. And so God, in Revelation, gives us a choice. Isn't it fascinating that the choice is between Zion, Jerusalem, and Rome, and the letters are sent to ecclesias right in the middle? We've got to decide to go to the left or the right. Where do our aspirations lie, with Rome or with Jerusalem? I set you before you Rome or Zion. Choose Zion, is what God's saying to us. Now, here are just some of the descriptions that God uses about this system. Anyone reading these will be left in no doubt whatsoever of what God's view of the Roman Catholic Church is. God says they are Babylon the Great. In other words, a greater manifestation than old Babylon of arrogance, idolatry, and iniquity. The mystery of iniquity. The arrogant horn with a mouth speaking great things from Daniel 7. The beast out of the bottomless pit. So they actually rise out of obscurity a number of times. A city spiritually called Sodom and Egypt. You know what God did to Sodom and what God did to Egypt. A cage of every unclean and foul vulture. The false prophet, the man of sin, the lawless one. A mouth speaking great things, speaking great blasphemies. The Pope parading as a lamb but speaking like a dragon. Full of the names of blasphemy, the abominations of the earth, a worthless shepherd from Zechariah 11. The mother of harlots, the great whore or a prostitute. A ruthless persecutor of God's servants, drunk with the blood of saints. You see, that's how God sees it. And so when we come to Revelation, God's all the way through has the thread of the kingdom, of the overthrow of the nations in the world, the destruction of political forces and kings subdued to the reign of Christ. But from God's view, the most important thing he's going to do is not just control the nations. He's going to rid the world of this cancer, of this terrible system of Catholicism. And that's why the focus God gives to the saints is their privilege to be involved in the destruction of the Roman Catholic system. And what we see in chapter 17 is the final stage of the Roman system. We've seen different stages. As we go through Revelation, you see different types as the church goes through it and evolves into different forms, as the Pope gets different powers at different times. And then we see in the Vials in chapter 16 how Napoleon and the French armies brought the papacy to nothing, took away their armies, locked them up in the Vatican. What we're going to see in chapter 17 is the last manifestation of this system as the woman riding the beast. Look at verse 14. This is the kings who the woman rides, the woman riding the beast. These make war with the Lamb. So we have the battle here between Christ and the church after Armageddon. And that's the battle that we're going to take part in, because it says that when the Lamb fights this church, there's going to be people with him. And that's why we have to make sure we've got our thinking aligned to what Christ is going to do in the world. Now, let's just briefly trace in the scriptures the rise and fall of this church. It's gone up and down in power over the years. But here's how God describes it. An arrogant, blasphemous, proud, persecuting little horn. A small power that starts off, but then develops into this mouth that speaks great things against God. And Daniel 7 says it'll be destroyed by fire. 2 Thessalonians, the apostate man of sin, parading as God on earth. And it's the papal system again, prophesied by Paul the apostle. Again, destroyed by fire. Revelation 13, the beast of the sea and the beast of the earth, two different stages of the papacy. The domination of the Dark Ages. Chapter 14 describes the complete fall of Babylon after Armageddon. Chapter 16, the fierce destruction of Rome by God's wrath. And in Revelation 16, just flick back there. I want to just make one point that I missed to make last night. In verse 19, it says, and the great city was divided into three parts. What that means is that after Armageddon, there's going to be three different phases of the destruction of the Roman Catholic system. So the first one will be the city of Rome itself. That will go. Then there's going to be the domination and then the eradication of the woman and the beast power, the rest of Catholicism uniting with Europe to fight Christ. That will go. And then there will be the destruction of Catholicism all over the world. And of course, there are many more Catholics outside of Europe than there is in Europe. So God has there's three different stages, three parts that God actually destroys Babylon stage by stage. So it's in Revelation 14, Revelation 16, again, a fierce destruction. And it talks in chapter 16 about earthquakes and fire and hailstones, all the symbols of divine wrath. In chapter 18, verse 21, it talks about the destruction of Rome as complete as throwing a millstone into the sea. So right through the Bible, this is a constant theme from God about the way he intends to eradicate this church. You can't miss it. It's so clear. Remember Daniel 7, a mouth speaking great things. Well, it's the same in Revelation 13. And it's the way the church has spoken evil things about God and about Christ and about doctrine that God so much hates, a mouth speaking great things and blasphemy, power was given unto him to continue 42 months. So for 1260 years, the papacy had armies that would go around and would wipe out anyone who didn't agree with their doctrines. You might have heard of the Inquisition, the great tortures of people, the wiping out of different people like the Albigenses and the Waldenses and all the other people they persecuted. And the wars of the Catholics were many. For 1260 years, they actually persecuted people. Great blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle and them that dwell therein. And so we have this power that arose. Once the emperors of Constantinople gave the Pope armies to enforce his doctrines upon people, so this system ran rampant through the earth for so long. And the little horn power was an arrogant power that rose in the earth. Well, it said in Daniel 7, another thing that this church would do was not only speak great words against the Most High, but he would wear out the saints of the Most High. And that's by the persecutions that came. They would change times and laws. They would make the Feast of Saturnalia into Christmas. They would make Passover into Easter, bringing in all the Babylonian and the old ancient pagan doctrines and feasts and things. And they changed times and laws. And again, we have the 1260 years in Daniel 7, verse 25. But God says they'll be characterized not only by their arrogance, not only by their doctrines, but by their persecution. And so it was. So we have to correctly perceive the Roman Catholic Church. The world doesn't accept criticism of other churches anymore. Once the churches just love having doctrinal battles. Now it's very hard to get anyone to argue on doctrine. Everyone has become tolerant. And our denunciation of the church is regarded as being arrogant and bigotry. And we have to be prepared to take the criticism for that because God sees it that way. We have to align with what God's revealed. He hates wrong doctrine. He hates religious fraud. He hates corruption. He hates pride. And God clearly hates this system. It's so obvious when you read these chapters that God has a terrible hatred of this system because it's corrupted his one truth and led millions to death because they couldn't believe and couldn't even find the faith anymore. This is the church that locked up Bibles for centuries, that burnt those who tried to translate the Bible into English because they wanted people to follow the church and not the Bible. Let's just be clear on one thing, though. We don't hate the individual Catholic. We feel sorry for them. They're deluded. They're led astray by the pomp and the grandeur. But we hate the system that has left them in such a terrible position. We hate the doctrine. We hate the persecutions, the fraud, the lies, and the political control. And we're going to be with him in the day when these things are taken away. So right from the first ecclesial world, Paul predicted the rise of the papacy as an evil system that was coming. He said that day will not come unless there be an apostasy first. And the Greek word there, the falling away, is an apostasy, a leaving the faith. And the result of that would be the revealing of the son of perdition, the man of sin that would come. So here's one of the major prophecies that Paul ever gave, the arrival of the Catholic Church, and particularly the papal system. And he would sit in the temple of God, said Paul, and he would declare to himself that he is God. What an incredible thing for a human being. And popes die with great regularity, but they all of them sit on the throne and proclaim themselves that they are God on earth. They sit in the temple of God, taking the reverence of all their worshippers and the cardinals in red. And of course, they call St. Peter's the temple of God upon earth. St. Peter's church, that they say, is regarded as the temple of the Lord. So they actually claim that they sit in the temple of God. And they proclaim themselves to be God. Pope Nicholas said, I'm able to do almost that God can do. What can you make me but God? How remarkable was Paul's prophecy. They exalt themselves. The Lord our God no longer reigns. He's resigned all power to the Pope. Think how God in heaven stewed over this. It's incredible, when they, in 533, when they gave the decree giving the Pope power the 3 years that followed were the worst climate years in the whole history, the known history of the world, with volcanoes and earthquakes and all kinds of things and great darkness for a couple of years. You know, God was so upset with what they did when they put the Pope in power. You go back and look at it. Look at the year 536, one of the worst years in the climate history of the world. Because they said this, that God's given over power to the Pope. Pope Pius, he says, does the Pope speak? It is Jesus Christ who speaks. See, this is the arrogance that God hates. This is the mouth speaking great things against God. Incredibly, unbelievably arrogant. Well, there were more prophecies by Paul. In Timothy, the Spirit, he says, speaks very clearly to us that in the latter times some shall depart, again, apostatize from the faith. They'll move away from the correct doctrines of salvation, giving heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of demons. And of course, that is the church's doctrine of saints. They have, every day of the year has some saint attached to it. And you go to the countries where Catholicism is rife, and they have all these little idols to different saints every day of the year. You get in a jeepney in the Philippines, and, you know, I think it's Saint Nicholas or something, but, you know, if you've ever ridden in a jeepney, you know how dangerous it is. And they have, you know, on the front, God help us, Saint Nicholas save us, something like that. But, you know, everything is geared to their saints, their doctrines of demons, departed saints that they put in power. Goes on to say that they'll be characterized by restricting meats, forbidding to marry. And they brought in the doctrine of celibacy for monks and nuns and all the other people and all the different orders with celibacy, not getting married. Won't eat meat on Fridays. And in countries where they have control, these things are very strictly enforced. So you can see, can't you, that there was predictions about these things very clear in the Bible. But he also said they would speak lies in hypocrisy. One of the things that brought the Reformation was the sale of indulgences. Back in the 1500s, the church was broke. They needed to repair the St. Peter's in Rome. And so the Pope came up with a great scheme. He sent a man called Tetzel out to go out through Europe to sell indulgences. And these were pieces of paper that actually you could buy at great cost, and the price varied how much, but according to what sort of money you had. So the more money you had, the more dear it was. But you could buy the indulgences, and it would actually reduce either your time or your relative's time in purgatory, because Catholics believe that when they die, your soul goes to purgatory. Babies go to limbo. But in purgatory, you're tortured for a number of years in fire and all those things that are horrible about hell. The really bad people go straight to hell, but the good ones go to purgatory to be purged. And if you want to reduce your time in purgatory, you could buy an indulgence. And the Pope guaranteed by signing the bottom of the paper that you would have less time in purgatory. Interesting, isn't it? In South America today, they still run lotteries for the relief of dead souls. So you buy a lottery ticket with the hope that if you win the lottery, one of your relatives will actually have less years burning in purgatory. Great money scheme for the church, doesn't cost them a cent, they give out the prize. So this is the sort of church you've got, you know, speaking lies in hypocrisy. And it was this sale of indulgences that got Martin Luther so angry that he started the Reformation. He took the church on over the matter of indulgences, as well as the immorality of the church. You know, this is why in chapter 17, 18 and 19, God gives us explicit detail on why and how he's going to destroy this system. You know, they got away with this for years. And if we just come to the last 5 chapters now, I want to just talk about these 5 chapters as a section. One thing I've learned over the years about Bible study is that the chapter divisions are put in by the translators. They are not part of the original unless you're dealing with the Psalms. So take that on board. So we're very structured the way we learn to read, because we do our Bible readings and we read to the chart. But quite often, because the chapter division's in the wrong place, we actually miss some very interesting connections. Sometimes a section is cut off halfway through. Sometimes one verse is in the wrong place. If you look at between 2 Corinthians 6 and 7, you'll see that the first verse of chapter 7 is the end of chapter 6. And there's a lot of places where the chapter division is in the wrong place. So I put it to you as an exercise in the future, challenge to chapter division. Many of them are quite okay, but they're put in by the translators, not by God. So when we come to these last 5 chapters, they've got quite a few things wrong. Chapter 17 is part of the 7th vial that began in chapter 16 and verse 17, the 7th vial. This is a continuation of the 7th vial. What we get in chapter 17 is the final manifestation of papal opposition to God. So we've seen a whole through Revelation, a whole lot of different ways the church developed and the way they behaved. In chapter 17, you have the last one of how they will behave in opposing Christ. Chapter 18, and chapter division's not too bad there. It actually says that in chapter 18, this is how the impact of the destruction of Rome will affect the world. In chapter 19, we have the true bride of God rejoicing over the destruction of the church. And we also have the rider on the white horse who goes out to conquer the nations. The next section should actually be, so it should be chapter 18 to chapter 19, verse 10 should be a section. Chapter 19, verse 11 to 21:8 is also another section. And because it takes you from the time that the nations are conquered right through to the end of the millennium. So it does the next 1,000 years in one fell swoop from 1911 to 21 verse 8. And that's the end of the history section. We can't go beyond the end of the millennium. God's all in all at that stage. What do you then have at the end of Revelation? In chapter 21 verse 9 to 22 verse 5, you have the Lord Jesus Christ describing the kingdom of the saints as a bride city. So he goes back now to the start of the millennium and he says, this is the way the saints will have come to become the bride of Christ. These are the mechanisms that make you part of the new Jerusalem. And then in the last part of Revelation, chapter 22, verse 6 to 21, the final warnings from Christ to his followers, the encouragement to continue in these things. So I really challenge you to think about the chapter divisions and read some of these things, read them in a different way, because unfortunately some of their chapter divisions they put in are not accurate. So we're dealing with the last 5 chapters. So chapter 17 is going to be this morning, and then the second session we'll just go through chapter 18 and 19, because chapter 18 is not that complicated at all. Okay, so Revelation 17 is part of the 7th vial. We've had the seals, the early Roman Empire falling apart, the trumpets, the rise of Mohammedanism and all that sort of stuff, the judgment on Christian Rome. Now we have the vials that actually pull apart the Holy Roman Empire. So there's been different phases where Rome has risen up and then been put down, risen up, put down. And we have the 7 vials. And we're living right at the end of the 6th vial. The 7th vial is about to happen after Armageddon. So just getting the picture of how this fits through in the history of Revelation. Okay, and so we come to this one. We come to the great harlot. This is the dramatic picture we see in Revelation 17. Now remember, if you just go back to the end of chapter 16, it talked there about how God would judge Babylon in verse 19. Great Babylon came in remembrance before God. And then we find, verse 21, a great hail fell upon men, a great earthquake that was upon the earth that affected everybody. And that's just a summary of the 7th vial. What now happens is that the angel of the 7th vial now takes John aside and says, okay, John, there's going to be Armageddon. The 7th vial is going to destroy the Catholic system, conquer the nations. But let me show you, John, exactly why this has to be done. So John and the angel have a very personal interaction going on. So chapter 17, verse 1, there came one of the 7 angels. Of course, it's the 7th angel, which had the 7 vials, and talked with me. He says, come hither. I want you to get involved, John. I want you to be part of this. And of course, whenever you see John being called aside by the angel, he's actually talking to us as well, because John represents us in the Revelation. You know, we're the interested party that's observing these things. So the angel says, you come over and look at this. I want to show you the judgment of the great whore that sits upon many waters. So he says there's going to be a judgment upon a prostitute that sits upon many waters. Now, later in the chapter, we get information to interpret that. Look at verse 15. He said to me, the waters which thou sawest, where the horse sits, are peoples, multitudes, nations and tongues. Now, Revelation 17 is a very helpful chapter because it's one of the few chapters where it actually interprets the symbols for itself. So he says, I'm talking about a woman, a corrupt religious system that actually controls the earth. She actually sits on many nations. She's in great power. And of course, at the time of the end, the Catholics will be. So he's describing this picture of a harlot. It's a very dramatic picture, isn't it? You've got this woman riding a beast with 7 heads, 10 horns. It's got a cup of horrible things in her hand, a cup of her fornication. She's a drunken harlot, clothed in purple and scarlet. Incredible picture, isn't it? The woman riding the beast. Very dramatic. Well, where does this idea of a corrupt harlot come from? Well, it began with the rise of Constantine. We won't go back, but Revelation 12 describes the rise of the corrupted church. So the church, or the ecclesia that was set up by Christ, was corrupted into a church as people moved to other doctrines. They brought in the Trinity, they brought in hell, they brought in heaven going. All these things came in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries. And so a church rose up that was corrupted. And so in Revelation 12, you see a woman representing Christianity who should have been a chaste virgin to Christ has now become a corrupted woman. She's expecting a child, and that child was Constantine. He then Christianized the Roman Empire, took away their paganism and made them a Christian empire. So this is the beginning of the corruption of the woman. From the ecclesia, people spoke perverse things. People wanted to draw away disciples after themselves. They brought in new doctrines and ended up with the Christian Roman system. It was a horrible system. It was just an adaptation of the pagan world under the name of Christianity. And they began to persecute the true saints. So we have a situation where we have this corrupted woman now becomes this harlot riding the beast. So it starts off with doctrinal corruption, ends up, the last manifestation is this woman, this drunken harlot riding a beast. Let's just pull this apart. How do we see this influence? Well, it says in verse 2, with this woman, the kings of the earth have committed fornication. The inhabitants of the earth have been drunk with the wine of her fornication. So she has seduced people into taking her as an authority on doctrine, on morals, and on politics. And the kings of the earth bow and scrape to the Pope, and they have always done so, except for a period between 1860 and 1930. Outside of that, since Christianity became the state religion in Rome, kings have bowed and scraped and worshipped the papacy. Why would a man like Putin go to meet the Pope? Because they need his influence. They need his control over people. And the Queen goes and visits the Pope. You don't often see the Pope going to visit the Queen. It's always the other way around. So the kings of the earth have committed fornication and made this person seem important. Well, in the Second World War, when the Germans were invading Europe, the papacy decided to protect themselves and their churches. They made a deal with Hitler. And so here's Cardinal Pacelli, who became the next pope anyway, sitting down with the German foreign minister to make a deal called the Concordat. Which the deal was that if the Nazis don't hurt the Roman Catholic churches, then the Catholic Church will not criticise the Germans. And so they were totally silent on the Holocaust. They never spoke against Hitler while he was on the up. And they made a deal. They committed fornication with the kings of the earth. So you have Hitler meeting the Pope at the start of World War II. And it just shows you how they control people. Well, Revelation 17. The kings of the earth committing fornication with the Pope. And they all go and visit the Pope. Very rarely the other way around. And when the new Pope is crowned, you will see every president, every head of state, every king or queen represented at Rome. Not so much when Prince Charles gets crowned. I bet the Pope doesn't come. It's always the other way around. And they all turn up because the Pope in the eyes of political leaders, is the most important person on the earth. You mightn't think that, but they all turn up when a new pope is crowned. That's how they see it. That's how God sees it. So here is this thing. So back to Revelation 17. He says, okay, I'm now going to show you the last stage of this Roman system. Verse 3. He carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness. So where is this beast going to be roaming? Where is it going to be? It's in a wilderness. Now, you think about that, a wilderness. In the Western world, which has been the most educated part of the world, we're talking about Europe since the time of the Roman Empire, how many ecclesias do you know of in Europe? How many in Germany? 2. One of them's about 10 members, one about 40 members. How many in France? 1, about 6 members. How many in Belgium? None. How many in Holland? A couple of little ones. Where's the wilderness of the people? Where's the wilderness of spirituality? It's in Europe. That's the great wilderness, isn't it? There's almost no Christadelphians in Spain, in France, in Austria, in Belgium, the Netherlands, Poland. A few here and there, but very few ecclesias. It's a wilderness of spirituality. This is the place where the church will roam at the end of time. So he carried away into the wilderness. Well, look at this. I'm just going to give you this definition very quickly of what these symbols mean. A barren, fruitless spiritual wilderness, Catholic Europe. Scarlet, the colour of sin, of course. The Catholic cardinals all wear red. So you get an assembly of cardinals, it's just red, red, red as far as you can see. The Pope wears garments of white, red and purple. The names, the papal titles, the church officers, the orders, the Jesuits, the brothers of St. John, the St. John of God, the Benedictines. They've got all these different orders, the Jesuits, the Opus Dei, incredible number of orders and names and titles that they invent. The 7 heads are 7 mountains. We're told that. You know, we're told the 7 heads are 7 mountains upon which the beast sitteth. And of course, this is the city of Rome. The 10 horns, pick it up from Daniel. There were 10 horns. There were 10 toes when the image of iron, Daniel 2. So 10 toes gives you the area of Europe, what the Roman Empire divided into. It's that area of Europe, Central Europe. Purple and scarlet, the arrogant claims to status of royalty and wealth, the massive church wealth we'll talk of in chapter 18. But we can't miss the identification of what this is talking about. The wine of her fornication. Doctrine and politics. You know, she's corrupted the world with her, making them drunk with her ideas. So you have the Trinity, where you have God and the Holy Spirit and Jesus all being part of a Trinity. The chart on the right explains how they explain it, that the Son is not the Father is not the Holy Spirit, but they're all God. You know, and this is the stuff that people have believed. 90% of Christians believe this. It all comes from the church. Their doctrine and politics, their intrigue, their financial control. Incredible what this church does. And you think of it, the worship of Mary, the worship of saints, the accumulation of property. You know, the church has admitted they've got 6,500 properties in Europe. The thousands of cathedrals all over the world, the schools, the monasteries, the nunneries, the banks, the hospitals, etc., etc. Well, the interpretation is given to us in chapter 17, verse 9. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. So you want to know what the 7 heads are? They represent 7 mountains. So the 7 heads actually represent 2 forms of identification. The first one is a geographical one. There are 7 mountains on which this system sits. So sitting upon 7 hills. Now here's an ancient Roman coin on which you see Roma or Rome sitting upon 7 mountains. That's how they depict themselves. There are 7 hills in the city of Rome, and they call themselves those 7 hills. When you look at that in artistic form, sorry about this, some of these slides are made by somebody else. There's the actual thing, so you can see it. Rome seated on 7 mountains. You know, that comes back from the time of, way back in the in time of John. Before John, it was already saying that we're a city on 7 mountains. So you can't miss the identification. The Bible gives you the identification of the geographical location of this place. So I might just mention that if you've ever been to the Clare Valley, just north of Adelaide, about 90 miles north of Adelaide, there's a town called Seven Hill. And there is in Seven Hill a monastery built in the 1800s by the Jesuits. It's a winery, and they supply most of the altar wine for Australian churches. So they're still pumping out the wine of their fornication. But there's a Jesuit monastery still there, and a massive cathedral built in a nondescript little valley called Seven Hill, because it's Roman. So, you know, it's interesting, isn't it? These symbols are consistent. But there's also a political identification of the 7 heads of the beast that the woman rides. So I want to just take you through this, because this is where it's a little confusing. So we're reading now, we're just going down about the 7 heads. All right, in verse 9, here's the mind that hath wisdom. So again, understand this. We've been encouraged to look at it. The 7 heads are 7 mountains, so that's clear. That's the geographical location. Then we have the political one. There are 7 kings, and it really should be 7 forms of government, 7 ways the place is being ruled. 5 are fallen, 1 is, and 1 is not yet come. Let's just deal with those. So before the time of John, there had been 5 forms of government of the Roman Empire: the regal, the consular, dictatorial, decemviral, tribunitial. So there'd been 5 different types of government for the Roman Empire. One is, John, you're living under the emperors. So now the system of government is the one that you live under. Is the 6th head is the imperial. So 5 have already been, 1 is now there, and the number 1 is yet to come. It only lasts a short space. So after the emperors were got rid of, the Goths moved in, and they set up their own king. Well, they only lasted 60 years. Then the Roman Empire completely fell apart. So there is the 7 heads identifying, again, the way Rome has been governed down through history. That's pretty obvious, isn't it? But then in verse 11, it gets confusing. The beast that was and is not, he's the 8th. He's of the 7 that goes into perdition. Now, right through chapter 17, you get this idea that the Roman Catholic system had a tremendous period of roaming over the earth for 1,500 years. And then they had a real dry period between 1860 and 1930, where they were just nobodies. They were put out of power, they had all their armies taken away, and they were not. So the beast goes through a stage where it has nothing. You might read in verse 16, there's a stage when they hate the beast and they hate the whore. So that she goes through a stage of not being accepted for a while. So what verse 11 says, there's going to be an 8th form of Roman government rise up, which is going to be of the same nature as number 6. Not number 7. It's going to be the same nature. It's going to be an emperor-style kingdom. So let's read verse 11. The beast that was and is not is the 8th, and is of the 7 and goes into perdition. So the one that will be finally destroyed is going to be a recreation of number 6. Okay? So number 6 is going to come back for a short time. The system of an emperor over the Roman Catholic system. So that's just explaining verse 10. So I want to go back now and just pick it up. So we have the identification. We have a geographic one, 7 mountains. We have a political one where these 7 forms of government have been experienced, and we're now waiting for number 8 to come along. And number 8 is the woman riding the beast. So this is the final phase. The final manifestation of this church is when the woman gets on the beast and starts riding it. So the beast, of course, is Europe, Central Europe. So the harlot's going to ride it. So we have here a remarkable prophecy. This is the 8th head stage. Okay, let's just take verse 11 to 13. I'll just go over it again just because I know it's complicated. The 6th head was the imperial system, successive emperors. the system which John lived under, one is. The imperial system was fatally wounded when the Roman Empire collapsed to barbarian invaders. So that's it says there that it was taken away, the sixth head was taken away. The imperial form we reinstated at the time of the end, thus becoming the eighth head. So we're going to see the revival of the sixth head in a form of the latter days. And when Rome heads up the armies of Europe to take on Christ in Jerusalem, they'll make war with the Lamb in verse 14. We're going to have this last stage of the Roman Empire being manifested. So Rome's not mentioned in Ezekiel 38. But we believe in Ezekiel 38 has some religious overtones. It says sanctify war. And we know that Rome has claims on many holy sites in Jerusalem, and they will work with Russia to encourage the Russians to invade the land of Israel. But Rome's not actually destroyed in Armageddon. Rome is destroyed after Armageddon. And we'll see how that's going to happen shortly. So we're dealing with a system that used to exist. The imperial system is going to come back in one last manifestation of opposition against the kingdom of Christ. Just going back to verse 5, the names of blasphemy. You know, it says there were names written on the forehead of this woman. Mystery. You know, the church loves its mystery. The mystery of iniquity, Paul called it in Thessalonians. All kinds of mysteries. The Trinity is a mystery. Mary worship is a mystery. Patron saints, indulgences, transubstantiation, worship of relics. All of these things are some of the mysteries of the church. The arrogance, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots. And of course, from the Roman Catholic Church has come every other church corrupted in doctrine. Almost every one of them, I believe, is the Trinity or immortal souls or something like, or the devil or something like that. So she's the mother of many harlot churches. The abomination of the earth. Think of the idols and the artworks and the Stations of the Cross, the confessional, the immoral clergy, pagan festivals, monasteries, flagellations, all of these things which are things the church has brought in. They've got nothing to do with the Bible. So they have all these strange doctrines, the names of blasphemy that they have. All the titles they have, the popes, the legates, the cardinals, the doges, the fathers, the curates, the mother superiors. It just goes on and on when you get to deal with the church. All the names of blasphemy they use. Well, when John saw it, in verse 6, he says, I saw the woman drunken with the blood of the saints and the blood of the martyrs of Jesus, and I wondered with great admiration. And the word admiration is a terrible translation. It should be astonishment or abhorrence. You know, John saw what this would do to his brethren and sisters, and he was astounded that this would be allowed to happen. And so John was greatly astonished by what he read about this woman. Well, Rome, of course, has been a great persecutor. Imperial Rome, the days of the emperors, treated our brethren like this. Either you worship the emperor as God upon the earth, or you die. You go into the Colosseum, or you're burnt at the stake, or something like that. But Rome was just brutal. When the Catholic Church got power, they became sadistic. And this is how they outshone the ancient Romans. They became incredibly dishonest. You want to read the story of John Hus. John Hus was a reformist who took on the church. He lived in Prague, in Czechoslovakia. He was invited to come to Constance. The Holy Roman Emperor, the Austrian, gave him guarantee that he would be safe if he came to Constance in Switzerland to debate the Pope on doctrine. Well, no sooner he got there than they locked him up, tortured him for weeks in every horrible way they could, and then burnt him. You know, he was totally betrayed by the Roman Catholic hierarchy. It was the most terrible thing that happened. So that's the brutality of the church. The Inquisition then perfected the refinements of torture. Estimated 68 million people were wiped out by the Catholics. And we won't go to all the gruesome tortures that they did, but some of them were incredible. I want to read about a man called Torquemada in the Spanish Inquisition. They did it all in the name of Christ, saying that they were serving God by wiping out the heretics and burning them at the stake and putting them on the rack. And you can go through these persecutions, forcing people to give up their faith by torture, by waterboarding and all those terrible things that torture involves. Shocking things they did to people in the name of God. See why God hates this? Not just because they destroyed the saints, they destroyed so many other people that didn't agree with the church as well. Then they persecuted those, some of whom we believe were probably our brethren in Christ. We haven't got enough record to be absolutely sure, but many of them seem to be very close to the doctrines we believe. And they were hounded from mountaintop to mountaintop and run down and burned at the stake. They wouldn't compromise their beliefs, and so they were put to the fire. And all of these things the church did for hundreds and hundreds of years to our brethren and sisters and to other people. If they wouldn't worship the beast, they would be killed. You see why God hates this? Why John was so astonished to see what was coming with this system. Daniel said they'll speak great words against and they'll wear out the saints of the Most High. And so they did. So John explains, or the angel explains to John in verse 8, the beast that you saw was, that's the imperial system, it's now gone, it'll come out of the bottomless pit, it'll come out of obscurity. When you read about the bottomless pit, it means total obscurity. It's going to come out of obscurity, but it will be finally destroyed. It will go into perdition. And all the earth shall wonder about that because they don't understand the Bible. Their name's not in the book of life. They won't understand why God has destroyed this system. And then he explains about the identification of this system. So what we're going to see in the time of the end is the papacy getting ascendancy over Europe, leading Europe in a war against Christ. And that is the woman riding the beast, the final stage of the papacy. In charge of the European armies. They're talking now about strengthening NATO's armies because of what Russia's doing. But you're going to see a time when they're going to go to war against Christ's kingdom in Jerusalem. Armageddon will be over. The Russians will be destroyed and all those that turn up in Israel will be destroyed. The world will be in great chaos because of the earthquakes. But there'll be an organised attempt by the Catholic Church to take on the kingdom of Christ. You've only got to read their beliefs about the Antichrist to see why they'll do it. They've always said that there'll be an Antichrist in Jerusalem, a Jewish king, that they will have to fight. And they'll get the whole of Europe on their side. And they will ride them in war against Christ. And the final battle is described in verse 12. The 10 horns, the 10 areas of ancient Roman Empire. 10 kings who will have a time with the beast. The beast will get with this woman and 1 hour with the beast. In verse 13, one mind to give their power and strength under this beast. So a combined Europe, ridden by the papacy, directed by the papacy, will make war with the Lamb in verse 14. And they'll fight Christ at Jerusalem. As I said, their false Antichrist theories are full of this king in Jerusalem they will have to fight one day. The odd verse here is verse 16. Because it says there, the 10 horns which you saw, they shall hate the whore and make her desolate and naked and eat her flesh and burn her with fire. And this is, if you like, an irony. The woman now riding the beast was for about 70 years put down by the nations. The nations of Europe under Napoleon and others conquered Roman Catholicism, took away their armies, locked the Pope up in the Vatican. And between 1860 and 1930, the papacy was nowhere, controlling nobody except the little Vatican square mile. But from 1930 onwards, they've come out of the woodwork and become a great power in the world once again. So the same nations that once put her under subjection and took away her power are now going to give their strength and power back to this system to fight the kingdom of Christ. And in verse 18, one last identification. The woman, says the angel, is the great city that reigns over the kings of the earth. And in John's time, it was, of course, Rome. So the time is coming when after Armageddon, after the destruction of the armies that come into Jerusalem, the Pope will ride the beast of Europe to go to war against the kingdom of Christ. And the result, God says in verse 14, these shall make war with the Lamb shall overcome them, for he's Lord of lords and King of kings, and they that are with him are called, chosen, and faithful. So we have a system where Rome and the nations of Europe will have power for 1 hour. Now, I'm quite open-minded about this. The 1 hour there could be a time period. I personally think it's actually talking about a particular moment in history. You'll see the phrase in chapter 18, verse 10, for in 1 hour thy judgment is come. Could very well be, but to get it to 30 years, to fit into the time frame of post-Armageddon events, you have to do a double conversion. And in Revelation, you only do a double conversion when the symbol is not appropriate. There's no reason, if it was to be 30 years, they could have put in 30 days. So in my mind, because there's no reason to do a double conversion, as you do in some places in Revelation, I suggest it is a time period, a particular time period. When we look at the apocalypse, we have in chapter 14, Armageddon. We have then to the nations, fear God and give glory to him. They don't submit. So the city of Rome gets wiped out. Then we have this conquest of the Catholic system right through the world, which will take very much part of 30 years. But the woman riding the beast will be 1 hour. And I believe it's just a moment of history where they oppose Christ, because it's not going to take 30 years for Christ to wipe out the opposition of Europe. So I think an hour is more likely a time, a season, predicted moment of opportunity rather than a 30-year battle. Under the papacy, they will have a short time of unity as they join forces to oppose Christ. The hour is a sudden, violent overthrow, and you get that in chapter 14, chapter 18. When Christ destroys this opposition, this woman riding the beast, this combined Catholic European opposition, it'll be a time of great sudden vengeance that comes upon them, obliterated by fire. And you can see that right through Revelation. And everybody's going to be astounded by the sudden extinction of Rome in 1 hour. So the time is coming when this is always going to be taken away. What does it mean for us today, brethren and sisters? Well, what a privilege that we're invited to be part of it. Never be confused by the modern concepts of the world that say everyone has equally valid truths, that all good Christians are going to be saved, that we shouldn't judge other religions. Remember the sufferings and the sacrifices of our brethren and sisters who stood against these evil doctrines, against this evil church, and gave their lives to do so. And I believe that when the time comes, that they will lead the vengeance, that they will be given the privilege of wiping out the system that took away their lives and their families and all the things that were deprived of them by the church when it was in power. And we need to pray for the day when we shall be with him to undertake the eradication of this evil apostate system. You know, it's a great privilege to be there amongst those who'll have that honour. This honour, says the Psalms, have all the saints to take away the evil of the world. But verse 14 does pose a question. Those that are with him are called, and we're all called. Chosen. We've all been chosen by God, given the opportunity to be part of it. But those that are with him will also be faithful. And that's the question we have to answer. Will we be faithful? Will we stay faithful to the end to these things that we know and understand? I want to say one more thing. If you've been around as long as some of us have, like James Bain and others, you'll have seen in the Brotherhood lots of different theories floating around about the book of Revelation. Very sad that it happens. People love to speculate and bring up with new ideas. But the interpretation, the continuous historical interpretation, has stood the test of time. It's been vindicated over and over again. And all the new theories that were around in the 60s and the 70s have been shown to be totally ridiculously wrong. You know, once the man of sin was Yasser Arafat, according to one Christadelphian. Well, he's dead, gone. So many people have tried to reinterpret Revelation, and they have one thing in common. All the new theories in Christadelphia have one thing in common. The church is not the bad guy. It's Israel, it's the Arabs, it's somebody else, anyone but the church. And yet you can't miss what God said about the church. It's clear, it's there. Never fall for the idea that we can't speak against the Roman Catholic Church and its doctrines. We don't hate its people, we hate the system, and we want to be part of its destruction. Let us hear what the Spirit says to the ecclesias.